The moment my sister accused me of practicing law illegally, I knew she was trying to erase my entire life with one calm smile. The room was too quiet for how much damage was being done. I was seated at the respondent table inside the Massachusetts Board of Bar. Overseers. Hearing room. My hands folded together so tightly my fingers had gone numb. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Panel members in dark suits. A few unfamiliar attorneys sitting in the gallery. And behind them, the people who were supposed to be my family. The air smelled faintly of old paper and furniture polish, the kind of scent that clings to buildings where reputations are decided in. Silence. Across from me sat my sister, Natalie Hartwell. Perfect posture. Neutral expression. That small, polite smile she always wore when she believed she was being reasonable. Natalie was 38. The compliance director at North Bay Freight Solutions, a title she carried like armor. She looked like she belonged there. I looked like the problem she had come to fix. She spoke clearly and evenly, her voice steady as she told the panel that I had been practicing law. Illegally. That I had misrepresented my credentials. That I had deceived clients and manipulated the system. She used careful words. Ethical concerns. Public trust. Duty to report. The kind of language that sounds responsible even when it cuts straight through someone's throat. I did not interrupt her. I did not shake my head or whisper objections. I kept my eyes forward and my breathing slow, just like Ruth Feldman had coached me. Silence is not weakness, she had said. Silence is strategy. Behind Natalie, I could see my mom twisting a tissue between her fingers. Dad sat beside her with his hands clasped, staring down at the polished wood floor like it might offer him an escape. Neither of them looked at me, at once. That hurt more than anything Natalie said. The presiding judge, Raymond Whitlock, listened without expression. He was in his early 70s, tall even while seated, with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of deciding other people's fates. When Natalie finished, he nodded once and reached for the file in front of him. That was when the room changed. I noticed it before anyone else. The way his hand paused just for a fraction of a second as he opened the folder. The way his eyes moved faster than before, scanning a page he had not expected to see. His jaw tightened. The color drained from his face so quickly it startled me. He turned another page, then another. The silence stretched. No one spoke. Not Natalie, not the panel, not even the court reporter. Judge Whitlock closed the file, stood up, gathered the papers into his arms, and walked out of the room without saying a single word. The chairs shifted. Someone whispered. Natalie glanced around, confusion flickering across her face before she smoothed it away. No one knew what was happening. I did. As I sat there, still silent, I felt something cold and steady settle in my chest. Tonight, someone was going to be destroyed, but it was not going to be me. Before I take you any further, let me pause for a second. When you are listening to this, what are you doing right now? Are you driving? Folding laundry, sitting alone with a cup of coffee? For me, I was sitting in that room staring straight ahead, thinking about how strange it is that a single moment can split your life in two. If this kind of story resonates with you, I would love for you to stay with me. Share your thoughts and follow along as I tell you how I ended up here. Because to understand how my sister tried to end my career in one afternoon, you need to understand the quiet choices that came long before this hearing ever existed. I am Olivia Hartwell. I am 32 years old. I have been a licensed attorney in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts since 2018. Every step of my career has been documented, verified, and earned the slow way. None of that mattered once Natalie decided I was a liability. Sitting in that hearing room, I could feel the weight of every conversation we had ever had pressing down on me. The dinners where she corrected my word choices. The holidays where she explained my job to relatives as if it were a phase. The way she always spoke for me when we were together, like I was something unfinished. I remember thinking how calm she looked, how confident. She truly believed she was doing the right thing. That was the most frightening part. My attorney Ruth sat beside me without moving. She did not touch my arm or whisper reassurance. She had told me ahead of time that this would be hard, that I would want to defend myself instinctively, that if I trusted the process and stayed quiet, the truth would surface on its own. Still, Nothing prepares you for being accused of fraud by your own sister, while your parents silently stand behind her. The panel members shuffled their notes. One of them cleared his throat, clearly unsure what to do without the presiding judge present. Natalie leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs, her smile returning as if she believed this sudden interruption worked in her favor. I kept my gaze forward. Inside, my thoughts were sharp and steady, not panicking, not angry yet, just focused. I thought about the first time Natalie asked me about my license, the casual way she had framed it. Just curiosity, just making sure everything was in order. I thought about the compliance audit she had mentioned months earlier, the stress she had brushed off as routine. I thought about how often people justify betrayal by calling it responsibility. Judge Whitlock was gone for less than 10 minutes. When he returned, he was not alone. A clerk followed him carrying a sealed envelope. The judge took his seat again, his expression unreadable, and placed the envelope on the table in front of him. He looked directly at me then, not as an accused attorney, but as someone he recognized. That was the moment Natalie's confidence faltered, just slightly, barely enough for anyone else to notice. The judge did not speak yet. He adjusted his glasses and glanced down at the file once more. The air felt heavier, charged with something that could not be taken back. I realized then that everything Natalie had built this accusation on was about to collapse under its own weight. She had counted on silence meaning surrender. She had mistaken my calm for fear. As the panel prepared to continue, I felt something else rise up inside me. Not relief, not triumph, just clarity. This was not about my career anymore. This was about the truth finally being louder than the family narrative I had been trapped in my entire life. And before this hearing was over, everyone in that room was going to see exactly who had been lying all along. That was when I knew I needed to go back to the beginning, back to the family that taught me early on what it meant to never quite fit, and how that lesson shaped every decision that brought me to this chair. Because I was not always the problem. I was just the one who refused to stay quiet forever. The Hartwell house sat on a quiet street outside Boston. The kind of neighborhood where lawns were trimmed every Saturday, and nothing looked out of place. Growing up, there felt like living inside a picture frame that never changed. Middle class, respectable, predictable. My parents believed deeply in doing things the right way. Go to the right schools. Choose the right careers. Avoid anything that makes the neighbors curious. Natalie fit that picture perfectly. She always had. From the time we were kids, she knew how to read a room. She learned early what adults wanted to hear and how to give it to them. Teachers praised her. Relatives bragged about her. Mom kept framed certificates of Natalie's accomplishments lined up on the hallway wall like proof that our family was doing something right. I was different. Not rebellious in a loud way, just inconvenient. I asked too many questions. I noticed contradictions. When something felt unfair, I could not let it go. That alone was enough to make it difficult. Mom cared deeply about how things looked, not in a cruel way, but in a quiet, anxious way. She believed presentation was protection. If we looked stable, then we were stable. If we looked successful, then we were safe. Natalie understood that instinctively. I did not. Dad believed in reputation. He came from a family that worked hard for every inch of respect they earned, and he carried that with him into adulthood. He taught us that once a name was damaged, it never fully recovered. Natalie absorbed that lesson and built her life around avoiding risk. I heard it too, but I drew a different conclusion. If a system punished honesty, then maybe the system needed to be challenged. At family dinners, the difference between us was always obvious. Natalie talked about her job in careful terms. Compliance, risk management, corporate responsibility. Words that made adults nod approvingly. When I talked about law school, or later about representing clients who could not afford private attorneys, the room always shifted. Mom would smile tightly and ask if I worried about my safety. Dad would clear his throat and remind me how competitive the legal field was. Natalie would jump in smoothly, reframing my choices for everyone else. She would say I was passionate, that I meant well, that someday I would settle into something more sustainable. It never sounded cruel. That was the genius of it. Every comment came wrapped in concern. But the message underneath was always the same. I was off script. Holidays felt less like celebrations and more like performance reviews. We would sit around the dining table, plates full, and the conversation would inevitably turn toward accomplishments. Promotions, salaries, stability. Natalie always came prepared with good news, a new responsibility, a new project, a recognition at work. When it was my turn, there was always a pause. Someone would ask how long I planned to keep doing legal aid. Dad would ask whether I had considered transitioning into something more lucrative. Mom would worry aloud about burnout. No one ever said I was failing. They did not have to. The silence said enough. I remember one dinner in particular, not because anything dramatic happened, but because it made everything clear. Natalie had just accepted a role overseeing compliance for a new division at North Bay Freight Solutions. Mom was glowing. Dad asked thoughtful questions. Natalie answered with calm confidence. When the conversation shifted to me, I mentioned a case I was working on, representing a warehouse worker wrongfully terminated after reporting safety violations. I talked about the evidence we had found, how the company tried to bury it. The room went quiet. Mom asked if I really wanted to be involved in something like that. Dad reminded me that companies have legal teams for a reason. Natalie smiled and said she admired my idealism, but that things were more complicated in the real world. That word again, complicated. I realized then that they were not uncomfortable because my work was dangerous. They were uncomfortable because my work challenged the same systems they depended on for comfort. Natalie thrived inside those systems. She learned the rules and followed them flawlessly. She believed in order, in hierarchy, in maintaining control. To her, ethics meant keeping things contained. To me, ethics meant confronting what others wanted to ignore. The gap between us widened quietly over the years. We did not argue. We did not fight. We simply stopped understanding each other. Natalie began to see my choices as irresponsible. I began to see her approval as conditional. Mom and Dad tried to smooth things over, always encouraging compromise. They wanted harmony. They wanted us to look like a united family. But harmony in our house often meant asking me to shrink. I learned early how to stay polite while being dismissed, how to smile while being corrected, how to swallow frustration because expressing it only made things worse. By the time I passed the bar and started practicing law, the dynamic was set. Natalie was the example. I was the exception. It was not that they hated me. That would have been easier. They tolerated me. They worried about me. They wished I would choose differently. And somewhere along the way, I understood something that hurt more than rejection. I was not disappointed. I was a disruption. I did not fit the story my family told about itself. I did not reinforce their sense of stability. I introduced uncertainty, and people who build their lives in order do not know what to do with uncertainty. Natalie saw that before anyone else did. She watched how my career unfolded, how I took on cases that made people uncomfortable, how I refused to compromise when something felt wrong. I think she believed she was protecting the family by keeping an eye on me. I do not think she planned to destroy me at first. I think she planned to contain me. Looking back, I can see the signs. The questions she asked were too specific. The interest she showed in my credentials, the way she framed everything as concern. At the time, I brushed it off. I was used to being the odd one out. I thought this was just another version of that. I did not understand that in Natalie's mind, my refusal to conform had crossed a line. It was no longer a personal choice. It was a liability. And when someone like Natalie decides something is a liability, they do not confront it emotionally. They manage it. Sitting in that hearing room later, with my parents behind her and the panel in front of me, I finally saw the pattern clearly. This was not sudden. It was the result of years of quiet judgment. Years of believing I was a risk that needed to be addressed. I was not hated. I was audited. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. It stripped away any illusion I still had about being misunderstood. I understood perfectly. And that understanding had led directly to the moment where my sister sat, across from me smiling while accusing me of fraud. As I sat there waiting for Judge Whitlock to return, I thought about how many times I had been asked to soften myself, to be less intense, less principled, less difficult. I thought about how often I had complied hoping it would make things easier. It never did. The truth was, the more I tried to fit, the more I disappeared. And somewhere deep down I had known this confrontation was inevitable. You cannot spend your life challenging systems without eventually threatening the people who benefit from them. The Hartwell family had always valued order over honesty. Natalie had simply taken that lesson further than anyone else. When the door at the back of the hearing room remained closed, and the murmurs grew louder, I felt strangely calm. Whatever came next, it would be real. No more polite dismissal. No more quiet disapproval. For the first time, my refusal to stay quiet was no longer just a personal flaw. It was about to become the thing that forced the truth into the open. And as I waited, I realized that I had stopped hoping my family would finally understand me. What I wanted now was much simpler. I wanted the truth to stand on its own, whether they were ready for it or not. The first time Judge Raymond Whitlock ever learned my name, I was standing in a cramped courtroom in Boston with a case no one else wanted. It was the spring of 2021, and I was still working full-time as a legal aid attorney, taking whatever walked through the door because someone had to. The case had come to me through a referral from a union rep who sounded tired and skeptical when he called. He warned me up front that the odds were bad, and the company lawyers were aggressive. My client was a warehouse supervisor who had been accused of falsifying shipping records. The charges were serious enough to cost him his job and possibly send him to prison. The company claimed he had manipulated logistics data to cover up losses. On paper, it looked airtight. Clean spreadsheets, perfect timelines, everything lined up just enough to make him look guilty. I remember sitting across from him in the interview room, watching his hands shake as he tried to explain what happened. He kept saying the same thing over and over. He did not do this. He did not know how the numbers changed. He just knew they were wrong. People think legal aid work is all speeches and courtroom drama. Most of it is long nights with cheap coffee, reading documents until your eyes burn. That case nearly broke me. I spent weeks going through shipping logs line by line, comparing internal reports with third-party carrier data. I learned more about freight routing than I ever wanted to know. Every time I found a discrepancy, it led to 3 more questions. Why did this timestamp not match the delivery scan? Why did the system show a correction that no one could explain? Why were edits made during hours when my client was not even on site? The prosecution treated me like an inconvenience. They expected a quick plea. The defense table was usually empty except for me and my client. No firm name, no backup team, just a folding chair and a stack of binders. Judge Whitlock presided over that courtroom like nothing impressed him. He did not indulge in theatrics. He did not tolerate rambling. He watched everything with quiet intensity. When attorneys tried to charm him, he shut them down. When they tried to intimidate, he stared until they folded. I knew I had to be precise. No speeches, no emotional appeals, just facts. The breakthrough came late one night when I noticed a pattern in the data. Edits. Certain changes were clustered around specific routes handled by a third-party logistics contractor that had recently lost a key major client. When I dug deeper, I found internal emails referencing pressure to make losses disappear. The edits were not random. They were intentional, and they were timed to coincide with shift changes that ensured my client would take the fall. Presenting that in court took everything I had. I walked Judge Whitlock through the timeline slowly, step by step. I showed how the system allowed retroactive changes. I demonstrated that the access logs pointed away from my client. I did not raise my voice. I did not dramatize. I let the evidence speak. The courtroom was silent when I finished. Judge Whitlock leaned back in his chair and looked at the prosecution. He asked one question. Could they explain the access records? They could not. When he dismissed the charges, my client exhaled like he had been holding his breath for months. I felt something else. Not triumph, relief. After the hearing, as everyone packed up, Judge Whitlock caught my eye. He did not smile. He did not congratulate me. He simply said that I had done my job properly. He said I followed the law. Coming from him, that meant more than applause ever could. I left the courthouse that day exhausted and anonymous. There was no headline, no celebration. I went back to my office and started the next case. I never imagined that moment would matter again. Sitting in the disciplinary hearing years later, watching Judge Whitlock stand up and walk out with my file. That memory came back with stunning clarity. The same man who once watched me dismantle a manufactured case now held Documents accusing me of fabricating my own credentials. The irony was sharp enough to sting. Back then, Natalie barely acknowledged that case. When I mentioned it at dinner, she nodded politely and asked how much legal aid attorneys even make. Dad reminded me that corporate compliance offered stability. Mom worried that I was taking on too much stress for very little reward. They did not see the value in what I did because it did not translate into prestige, but Judge Whitlock did. He saw competence where others saw inconvenience. That case taught me something important long before my sister ever tried to destroy me. Systems are not infallible. They are maintained by people, and people make choices. When I left the courthouse in 2021, I believed the system worked when someone was willing to fight carefully. Enough. I did not realize how quickly the same system could be turned against you by someone who knew how to use it. Natalie understood systems too. She just used them differently. As the panel waited for Judge Whitlock to return, I thought about how fragile trust really is. How years of work can be reduced to suspicion with the right paperwork. How easily authority shifts depending on who controls the narrative. I also thought about my client from that case. How close he came to losing everything because someone higher up needed a scapegoat. How powerless he felt until the truth surfaced. I was sitting in that chair now, accused of something I did not do, waiting for the truth to surface again. The difference was that this time, the person who set the trap was my own sister. I did not know what Judge Whitlock had found in my file. I did not know how this would end. But I knew one thing with certainty. I had walked into this fight with a clean record, a clear conscience, and a history the judge himself had witnessed. Natalie had walked in with confidence and paperwork she believed would protect her. Only one of us understood how dangerous false certainty could be. As voices murmured around me and the door at the back of the room remained closed, I sat still and waited. Whatever Judge Whitlock was doing behind that door, it was already reshaping the story Natalie thought she controlled. And somewhere deep inside, I felt the first quiet shift of momentum, subtle but unmistakable, like the ground beginning to move beneath someone who had always assumed it was solid. I did not understand it at the time, but that shift had started years earlier, right after the case in 2021. That was when Natalie began watching me differently. Not openly, not in a way I could easily point to, just small changes that felt insignificant on their own and unsettling when added together. At first it came as an interest. Natalie called more often. She asked how work was going. She wanted details, not the broad, polite updates we usually exchanged, but specifics. What kind of cases I was taking, who I was working with, how the court treated legal aid attorneys. I thought she was trying to connect. I told myself she was finally curious about my life. Then the questions shifted. She asked about my license, how renewals worked, what the reporting requirements were, whether there were audits for solo attorneys. She framed everything as casual curiosity. Just wanting to understand the system better, she said. It made sense given her role in compliance. Or at least that is what I told myself. One afternoon, she invited me to lunch near her office. North Bay Freight Solutions occupied a sleek building downtown, all glass and steel, the kind of place that projected efficiency and control. Natalie looked perfectly at ease there. She ordered confidently, talked about meetings, deadlines, internal reviews. Halfway through the meal, she mentioned an upcoming audit. Routine, she said, but stressful. A new regulatory framework. Tight timelines. She laughed it off, but I noticed the tension in her shoulders. Then she leaned forward slightly and lowered her voice. She said she had a question purely hypothetical. She asked whether I would ever be willing to review a procedural memo for her team, just to make sure the language was solid. No official capacity. No formal sign-off, just a second set of eyes. I felt my guard go up immediately. I told her I could not do that, not because I did not trust her, but because it crossed an ethical line. I explained that even informal review could be construed as legal advice, especially given her position. She smiled and waved it off. She said she understood. She said she was just asking, but her eyes lingered on me a moment longer than usual. After that, the requests became more specific. A question about compliance documentation, a hypothetical about record retention, a scenario involving internal controls. Each time I responded carefully. I gave general information anyone could find publicly. I refused anything that involved her company directly. Each time she nodded and thanked me. Each time I felt like I had just passed a test I did not know I was taking. Mom and Dad noticed the increased contact and seemed pleased. Mom mentioned how nice it was that Natalie and I were spending more time together. He said it was good for the family to support each other professionally. I did not argue. I did not want to seem paranoid. But something in Natalie had changed. She listened differently now, not to understand but to assess. Her questions were precise. Her reactions were measured. When I declined to help, she did not push. She filed the information away. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. Natalie had brought paperwork with her. Not obviously legal documents, but printed pages nonetheless. She waited until Mom stepped into the kitchen and Dad was distracted with the television before sliding them across the table toward me. She said her team was revising an internal compliance workflow. She said it would help if I could just confirm that the language did not create exposure. She emphasized that it was not a formal opinion, just reassurance. I looked at the pages. They referenced specific processes within North Bay, specific decision points, specific responsibilities. This was not hypothetical. This was real. I pushed the papers back toward her and said no. I told her I could not touch anything related to her company. I told her it was a clear conflict. I told her she knew that. Natalie laughed softly and said she thought I was being overly cautious. She said everyone did favors like this. She said it was not a big deal. That was the moment I saw irritation flicker across her face. Just for a second. Enough to know it was there. She collected the papers and smiled again. She said she appreciated my honesty. She said she just wanted to be careful. Mom returned to the room and asked if everything was okay. Natalie said of course. Dad did not look up. On the drive home, I could not shake the feeling that I had just refused something important. Not important to me, important to Natalie. Over the next few months, she stopped asking for help directly. Instead, she started asking about me. She asked Mom how busy I was. She asked Dad whether I was stressed. She framed her concern as worry. She also began mentioning my work in a different tone. Where before she called it admirable, she now called it risky. She warned my parents that legal aid attorneys often cut corners out of necessity. She said the system was unforgiving. Dad started asking more pointed questions when we spoke. He wanted to know whether I kept detailed records, whether I had coverage, whether I understood the consequences of mistakes. Mom asked if I had considered slowing down. I told myself it was a coincidence, that Natalie was under pressure at work and projecting, that I was reading too much into it. Then one evening, Natalie called and asked outright whether my license was current. I told her it was. I told her everything was in order. She paused, then asked how often I checked. She asked whether I had ever had issues with renewals. She asked whether the bar ever made mistakes. I answered calmly, but my chest felt tight. I asked her why she was so interested. She said she was just curious. After that call, I pulled my own records. I reviewed my filings, my renewals, my continuing education. Everything was clean, exactly as it should be. Still, the questions kept coming. I began to realize that Natalie was no longer trying to include me. She was trying to define me, to frame my work in a way that aligned with her concerns. She did not accuse. She documented. She did not confront. She observed. And slowly the realization settled in. Natalie was not gathering information out of curiosity. She was building a file. I think she told herself she was being responsible, that she was protecting her company, protecting the family, protecting order. In her world, risk had to be managed, and I had become a risk. The night before the disciplinary letter arrived, I lay awake thinking about that Sunday afternoon, about the paperwork I had refused to sign, about the look in her eyes when I said no. I finally understood that the line between concern and control had been crossed long ago. Natalie was not trying to understand me. She was trying to find a weakness, and if she could not find one, she was willing to create it. As that truth settled in, I felt something shift again. Not fear, awareness. Because once you realize someone is watching you closely, you also realize you are no longer dealing with family. You are dealing with an adversary. And adversaries do not need you to be guilty. They only need you to be vulnerable. That was the moment I understood that what was coming would not be a misunderstanding. It would be deliberate. And when it arrived, It would arrive dressed as responsibility, concern, and duty. I did not know yet how far Natalie was willing to go, but I knew with absolute clarity that she had already decided I was a problem that needed solving. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. I remember because I had been standing in my kitchen with my first cup of coffee thinking I finally had a quiet day ahead of me. I opened the mailbox without expecting anything unusual. Bills, flyers, a thin envelope with the seal of the Massachusetts Board of Bar Overseers stamped neatly on the front. I felt the air shift around me before I even tore it open. I carried it inside, set my coffee down, and slid a finger under the flap. The paper inside was crisp official, printed in the kind of language that never leaves room for misunderstanding. I read the first few lines twice, not because I did not understand, but because I understood instantly and wished I did not. The board had received a formal complaint alleging that I had been practicing law illegally. The letter stated that pending review a temporary suspension was recommended. They included a copy of the complaint. They also included a notice of an upcoming disciplinary hearing. I felt heat move up my neck, but my mind stayed sharply quiet. I sat down at the table and unfolded the accompanying documents. The complaint packet was thick, too thick for anything casual. Inside it was a signed statement from the complainant outlining the accusations in meticulous detail. I scanned the name at the bottom, even though I already knew. My stomach clenched anyway. It was Natalie. Not anonymous, not unclear, not a misunderstanding. A deliberate accusation signed by her hand. The language she used was measured and clinical. She wrote that she had concerns about inconsistencies in my licensing records. She wrote that she could not in good conscience ignore potential misconduct. She wrote that coming forward was her ethical responsibility. Then I turned the page and saw another sheet. It was an attachment with two signatures, my mom and my dad. They had signed statements affirming that they trusted Natalie's judgment and believed her concerns were legitimate. I stared at their signatures until the lines blurred. I had seen my mom's handwriting all my life, neat and careful. My dad's signature was strong and slightly slanted. Seeing both of them beneath words that accused me of fraud felt like a quiet knife sliding in without hesitation. There were no phone calls, no questions, no conversations, just belief in the daughter they trusted most, the one who fit their world and reassured them with order. I set the papers down slowly. I did not cry. I did not shout. I felt something colder and heavier than shock. It settled across my chest like a weighted blanket. I read every page carefully. The documents referenced dates, renewals, license confirmations. They included printouts of public lookup screens with portions missing or highlighted. Sections were taken out of context to look suspicious. As I turned the pages, I felt the ground of my life tilt slightly. This was not just sloppy work from someone outside the system. This was curated. This was built. Natalie had prepared this. I do not know how long I sat there before reaching for my phone. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I called Ruth Feldman. She answered on the third ring, her voice brisk but warm. I told her what I had received. There was a small pause. Then she exhaled and told me not to panic. She asked me to bring everything to her office that afternoon. I agreed. Before leaving the house, I stood at the kitchen sink and tried to understand how my life had shifted so suddenly. The kitchen looked the same. The morning light was the same, but something essential had broken, something that would never be put back the same way again. I arrived at Ruth's office with the packet tucked into a folder. She greeted me without fuss and led me to a conference room. I handed her the papers and watched her read them one by one. Her expression did not change until she got to the last page. She tapped her finger lightly on Natalie's signature. So it is her. She said it quietly, not surprised, not judging, just confirming what she already suspected. I swallowed and nodded. Ruth read the rest of the file with slow precision. When she finally looked up, she pushed her glasses higher on her nose and leaned back in her chair. Olivia, she said, this is not an amateur job. This is someone who understands how to create a narrative that looks credible at first glance. I felt my throat tighten. She continued reading sections aloud, pointing out how certain omissions made the documents appear suspicious. She noted how the complaint used phrasing common in internal corporate audits. Natalie's world. When she reached the signatures from my mom and dad, she paused again. She looked at me with something that might have been sympathy but did not. Soften her voice. You need to prepare yourself, she said. This will not be only a legal fight, it will be a personal one. I nodded again, staring at the table. Ruth folded her hands. I asked her the question that had been burning in my mind since I opened the letter. Should I respond immediately? Should I submit my records? Should I call the board? Ruth shook her head firmly. If you move too quickly, you give the complainant an opening. She will see what you dispute and adjust her story. People who file complaints in bad faith often look for opportunities to fix their mistakes. She let that sink in. If Natalie is as confident as she seems, it means she believes she has covered herself. We let her believe that. We let her walk into the hearing with the version of the story she is certain is airtight. A slow, cold feeling spread through me. I understood the strategy, but it went against every instinct I had. I wanted to refute everything. I wanted to confront the lies. I wanted the record corrected. Ruth saw the tension in my shoulders. I know this is hard, she said gently. You are honest by nature. You want to correct things immediately. But this is not a courtroom yet. This is positioning. If we respond too soon, we give her rope to tighten her case. Her tone was matter of fact, not cruel. It helped me breathe again. Ruth spread the documents out across the table, aligning them in a way that made them look almost harmless. Then she pointed to the sections referencing my parents. These signatures will complicate the emotional side of this for you, but legally they are meaningless. They only show that she convinced them, not that she is right. I felt something slide inside my chest then, a sensation like grief that had not fully formed. I asked Ruth whether she believed I had reason to worry. She shook her head. Your record is clean, Olivia. Your work is documented. There is nothing here that could actually suspend your license. The danger is in the narrative she is building. That is what we will dismantle. But timing matters. She leaned forward slightly. Here is what we do. You gather every piece of documentation you have. Renewal confirmations, continuing education, certificates, payment receipts, any communication with the bar related to licensing. Do not send anything. Bring them only to me. I will review everything silently. I nodded. Then she said we wait. I asked her how long. Until she commits to her story fully. Until it is too late for her to adjust. She thinks she knows the system well enough to weaponize it, so we let her believe she is winning. Her voice held no malice, only strategy. When I left her office, I felt as if the world had narrowed down to two paths. One was the familiar one where I defended myself immediately, corrected the record, fought the accusation head on. The other was the path Ruth laid out, controlled, patient, calculated. I chose the second path because the first one had already been taken from me. That evening, I opened my laptop and began gathering my records. Years of documentation, scanned files, emails, certificates, renewal confirmations. I arranged them in chronological order, checking each one carefully. Everything was where it should be. Everything was consistent. Everything was clean. At one point, I stopped and stared at the screen, remembering the way Mom used to ask if I ever worried about being overlooked, remembering how Dad used to say reputation was fragile. Now their signatures sat beneath an accusation that could dismantle my career. I wondered whether they had hesitated at all, whether they had read what they were signing, whether they believed I was capable of what Natalie described, or whether they simply trusted her more because she had always been easier to understand. Before going to bed, I read the complaint packet once more. I forced myself to see it not through my own eyes, but through the eyes of someone who did not know me. The structure was clean. The insinuations are subtle. The tone is authoritative. Natalie had not filed a reckless complaint. She had filed a strategic one. As I closed the folder, a calm resolve spread through me. I understood now that silence was not surrender. Silence was preparation. It was giving the truth space to expand, while the lie tightened around itself. I would not call Natalie. I would not call my parents. I would not give anyone the chance to rewrite what they had already done. Ruth was right. If Natalie believed she had won, then she would walk without caution. She would commit to her version completely. And when the time came, that commitment would be the very thing that undid her. I turned off the light and stood in the quiet of my living room, feeling the weight of what was coming. Not fear, not despair, just the stillness before a storm begins to reveal its shape. The next morning, I carried the folder of records to Ruth's office. She had already brought in someone she trusted, a digital forensics consultant named Caleb Monroe. He was in his mid-30s, soft-spoken, with a calm confidence that immediately put me at ease. He greeted me politely, then spread the documents across the table with careful hands. Ruth closed the door behind us and said we were going to go through everything line by line. No assumptions, no shortcuts. If Natalie had built a narrative, we needed to dismantle the foundation quietly before the hearing. She took her seat while Caleb opened his laptop and pulled the first pages toward him. He began by examining the complaint packet itself, not the accusations but the structure. He checked formatting, alignment, file properties, and the metadata embedded in the documents. I watched him click through windows I did not fully understand, but his eyes moved with intent. He murmured something under his breath and tapped the screen lightly. "This is interesting." Ruth leaned in. I stayed still waiting. Caleb enlarged a metadata panel and pointed to the creation timestamp. It was recent. Too recent. The complaint was dated several weeks earlier, but the file properties showed it had been created far more recently than that. He kept reading. Then he checked the modification date. Another discrepancy. Edits made at peculiar times. Hours that did not match the timeline in the narrative. He highlighted a field showing the software used. It matched a program commonly used within North Bay Freight Solutions. He looked at me then. "Did your sister prepare these?" I swallowed. "It appears so." He nodded slowly and went back to work. The next document was a supposed email from the bars, acknowledging concerns about my licensing. It looked official at first glance. Correct font, correct header, correct tone. But as Caleb zoomed in on the header details, his eyebrows lifted. "Forged," he said softly. Ruth exhaled through her nose, not surprised but clearly irritated. The domain was wrong. Not obviously wrong, but wrong in a way that only someone familiar with electronic correspondence protocols would catch. The reply to the address did not match the sender address. The embedded routing stamp revealed a private mail server, not a government one. "Either your sister does not know what she is doing," Caleb said, "or she knows exactly what she's doing." He moved on to the next set of attachments, including the printouts of my license lookup. Parts were missing, sections cropped. The gaps were positioned strategically to create the appearance of inconsistency. Caleb frowned as he zoomed in on the corners of the page. "This is sloppy," he whispered, "but only if you know what you are looking for." Most people would panic and assume the worst. Ruth asked if there was anything definitive enough to expose as manipulation. Caleb nodded. "There is one thing that caught my eye. The license number here uses the new formatting style, the Commonwealth only, introduced after 2022, but the lookup she printed is supposedly from before that. It is impossible for that number to appear in that format at that time." He looked up at me with quiet certainty. "Your sister overplayed her hand." I sat back, letting those words settle. Evidence of tampering was one thing. Evidence tied directly to North Bay Systems was another. Caleb continued examining each document, and each one revealed more inconsistencies. The email headers, the timestamps, the inconsistent fonts on sections meant to mirror government language. Ruth leaned back in her chair with her arms crossed. "It is a narrative built on a foundation of sand, but we cannot reveal any of this until the hearing. If we alert her earlier, she will rewrite everything. She will fix the weaknesses." I understood. If Natalie believed she had already won, she would not revisit her files. She would not question her strategy. She would not prepare for a counterattack. We needed her certainty to destroy her. Caleb asked to see my personal documents next. I handed him everything organized chronologically. He scrolled through my renewal confirmations and nodded with approval. "Everything here is exactly as it should be. No discrepancies, no gaps, nothing missing. The timestamps match your bar renewal history. There is no conceivable way any governing body could interpret this as misconduct unless they were handed a manipulated narrative first." He paused, then added quietly, "That is exactly what happened." Ruth took notes in her deliberate handwriting. "We will not respond. We will not file anything yet. We will allow the board to see the complaint as it stands. And when she presents her fabricated evidence, we will counter with unimpeachable proof." I asked what else I needed to do. She studied me for a moment. There is one more thing we need. A physical record. Something that cannot be altered electronically. Something that predates all this. I knew exactly what she was talking about before she said it. The microfiche. Every attorney licensed in Massachusetts has a physical licensing record, stored on microfiche. It cannot be altered without leaving a trace. It is a permanent analog record. It is the one thing Natalie could not fake. Ruth told me to file a request for a microfiche copy of my original licensing. Documents, not electronically, not by phone, in person. She said it was important for the chain of custody. That afternoon, I drove to the office of bar admissions. The building was old, the lobby echoing with footsteps and muted conversations. I approached the counter and asked for a copy of my microfiche record. The clerk gave me a form. I filled it out carefully, watching each stroke of the pen, feeling the weight of what this meant. Once I submitted it, the clerk told me the record would be retrieved within a few days. I thanked him and stepped outside into the cool air. The wind cut sharply across my face, but the sensation grounded me. The physical record would prove everything. Still, when I got back into my car, I felt a tightness in my chest. Not fear, not uncertainty. A deeper recognition that this war had already moved past the point of return. Natalie had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Over the next few days, while waiting for the microfiche request to process, Ruth and I continued preparing quietly. Caleb reviewed more digital files, checking for anything Natalie might have left behind carelessly. He found several inconsistencies in the font spacing of the printed documents, another indicator of tampering. He also discovered that some of the files were saved from a user account, tagged within North Bay's internal system. He could not access the full audit trail, but the glimpse was enough. Ruth shook her head. If she had been patient, she might have made this believable. But she rushed it. She is operating from fear, not confidence. I thought about that. Fear. It was strange to think Natalie, who always appeared so controlled, could be afraid of anything I did. But the more I reflected on the last few years, the more it made sense. She lived in a world where compliance was survival, where mistakes carried consequences beyond paperwork, where exposure meant more than embarrassment. If she believed even for a moment that my choices threatened her stability, she would eliminate the threat. As we reviewed the evidence together, I felt a growing sense of detachment, like watching a storm from a distance, knowing it was moving toward me, but also knowing I was not powerless. One afternoon, as Caleb clicked through timestamps, he paused and looked at me. "Can I ask you something?" he said gently. "Did she ever ask you for legal help related to her company?" I nodded once. "Yes, I refused." He sat back and exhaled softly. "That explains her angle. She needed plausible deniability. If she could paint you as careless with boundaries, she could frame the entire narrative around that." At that moment, something clicked. The questions she had asked, the documents she brought, the scenarios framed as hypotheticals. Natalie had not been concerned. She had been gathering context. She had been building justification long before the complaint was filed. Ruth closed the folder and looked at me firmly. "Olivia, this will get worse before it gets better. You need to understand that. She will not expect resistance. She believes she has the authority of her role. She believes she understands the system better than you do." I looked between the two of them. "Do you think we can win?" Ruth did not hesitate. "Absolutely. But you need to stay quiet. No contact with her. No contact with your parents. No corrections. No explanations. Silence is your strongest position." I understood. It was the same strategy I had used in court before. But it felt different when the adversary shared my blood. Days passed slowly while we waited for the microfiche confirmation. Each morning I woke up with a tightness in my stomach. Each night I wondered what Natalie was telling my parents. Whether they believed they were helping. Whether they questioned anything at all. When the notification finally came that the microfiche copy was ready, I drove back to the bar admissions office. This time I felt a strange calm. The clerk handed me a sealed envelope. Inside it was a film sheet, thin and cold, containing the unalterable proof of my licensing history, the original application, the approval, the bar exam results, the notation of my swearing in, all dated correctly, all verifiable. I held the envelope in both hands, feeling the weight of something that should never have been needed, but now meant everything. When I delivered the microfiche to Ruth, she inspected it carefully. then nodded with satisfaction. "This is your anchor," she said. "No matter what she presents, this cannot be rewritten." I sat down across from her, feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. "What happens if this fails?" I asked softly. Ruth studied me for a long moment before answering. "If it fails, you lose your license, your career, and your professional credibility." She said it plainly without softening. But then she leaned forward. "If it succeeds, your sister loses far more. She loses her credibility. She loses the shield of responsibility she hides behind. And she exposes herself as someone who weaponized the system for personal reasons." I took a slow breath. For the first time, the magnitude of what we were doing fully hit me. This was no longer about defending myself. It was about what would happen when Natalie's narrative collapsed under the weight of the truth she had twisted. I left Ruth's office with the understanding that there was no turning back. Not for me, not for her. If I failed, my career was gone. If I succeeded, Natalie would have nowhere left to stand. That was the moment I realized the storm was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. The storm was no longer approaching. It had already arrived. The morning of the hearing felt colder than it should have for late spring in Boston. I remember stepping out of my car and noticing how the air seemed unnaturally still, like the whole street was holding its breath. The building that housed the Massachusetts Board of Bar Overseers looked same as it always did, gray stone and unyielding. But walking toward it that day felt like approaching a wall that could either protect me or crush me. Ruth met me at the entrance. She had her usual calm expression, the one that made her seem carved from something steadier than the rest of us. She asked if I was ready. I said yes, even though readiness felt like a fragile illusion. Caleb had already arrived. He stood near the metal detector, hands in his pockets, giving me a small nod. His presence meant more than I could say. We rode the elevator together in silence. When the doors opened onto the hearing floor, the hallway was already bustling. Attorneys, clerks, board members. The hum of soft conversation filled the air, but I only heard one thing: my own heartbeat. The door to the hearing room was open. I stepped inside and immediately saw my parents. Mom sat clutching a tissue, already teary-eyed. Dad sat stiffly beside her, staring straight ahead. Neither of them looked at me. Natalie sat across the table from where Ruth motioned for me to sit. Her posture was perfect. Her suit was flawless. Her expression was composed with that same careful restraint she had worn all her life. She looked like she belonged here, like she had been preparing for this moment. When our eyes met, she gave me a small, solemn nod, as if she were sorry it had come to this, as if she believed this was necessary. Ruth touched my arm lightly, a reminder to breathe. I took my seat. The chair felt colder than the room should have allowed. Judge Raymond Whitlock entered a few minutes later. He looked exactly as I remembered him from 2021. Reserved, controlled, no wasted motion. He took his seat at the center of the panel, adjusted his glasses, and opened the file in front of him without ceremony. The room quieted instantly. Natalie began her testimony with an ease that made my stomach tighten. She spoke clearly, confidently, her voice steady. She described her concerns about my licensing status. She cited the inconsistencies she believed she had discovered. She spoke about integrity, responsibility, ethical obligations, all the language of compliance. Her tone was not vindictive. It was clinical, almost compassionate. She framed me as someone who had perhaps become overwhelmed, someone who might have cut corners unintentionally, someone whose record did not align with the expectations of the profession. She painted me as a danger not out of malice but out of necessity. Mom wiped tears as she listened. Dad kept his eyes fixed on the table. I wondered if either of them noticed that Natalie never once said she had spoken to me directly about any concern. I wondered if they cared. Ruth remained perfectly still beside me, but I could sense the tension in her shoulders. She scribbled notes, but her expression never changed. At one point, Natalie shifted slightly in her seat and glanced toward me with an expression that could almost pass as sorrow. Not real sorrow, but the kind someone wears during a performance. She said she had wrestled with this decision. She said family made it harder. She said she hoped I would understand someday. It was the kind of speech that would convince an audience unfamiliar with her. But I knew better. And deep down I suspected Ruth knew too. When the panel asked if I wished to respond, Ruth shook her head almost imperceptibly. I remained silent. I kept my hands folded in front of me, kept my gaze level, kept my breathing steady. Natalie looked surprised for a brief moment. Then she straightened and continued. Caleb sat in the back row of the audience, observing quietly. When I glanced his way, he gave a subtle nod, as if to reassure me that my silence was the loudest statement I could make. Right now. Then it happened. Judge Whitlock shifted his attention to the file in front of him. He turned the first page, then another, then another. His eyes narrowed slightly. His left hand paused halfway through a page turn. His jaw tightened. I noticed the exact moment recognition hit him. It happened in a flash so small that no one else seemed to catch it, but I saw it. His hand trembled, just enough for the corner of the page to flutter. He leaned back slightly in his chair, studying the documents as if something inside them had caught him off guard. He turned to a particular page with more care this time, reading it again, slower. Natalie continued speaking, unaware that she no longer held the room. I watched him carefully. I knew that look. I had seen it before, 2 years earlier, when I stood in his courtroom presenting evidence that dismantled a fabricated narrative. I remembered how he had narrowed his eyes then too, how he had weighed each detail with precision. And now he was weighing this. He turned another page. His breath caught. I saw him close his eyes briefly as if recalling something long buried. He opened them again and stared at the sheet for a full 5 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Natalie paused mid-sentence, confused by the shift in his attention. She watched him closely, waiting for him to speak. He did not. Instead, he closed the file slowly, gathering the papers with a firmness that made the room fall silent. He stood up without a word, lifted the file from the desk, and walked toward the back door of the hearing room. Everyone stared after him. Even the panelists exchanged glances, uncertain. Natalie recovered first. She straightened in her seat, folded her hands in front of her, and whispered just loud enough for the panel to hear that she understood. She said she knew this was difficult for the judge. She said she sympathized. She said she realized he must be deeply disturbed by what he had seen in my file. She believed he was disgusted with me. She believed she had won. Mom reached for her tissue again, clutching it so tightly it threatened to tear. Dad finally lifted his eyes, but he looked not at me, but at the empty doorway where Judge Whitlock had disappeared. Ruth leaned closer to me and whispered, "Stay still. Do not react." I did not move. I barely breathed. Natalie continued speaking softly to the panel, her voice laced with concern and righteousness. She said she hoped the board would act quickly. She said the integrity of the profession depended on decisive action. She said she took no pleasure in this. Her performance was flawless. But something in the room had changed. I could feel it like a shift in pressure. The air was different. The silence felt heavy, expectant. Caleb was still watching from the back row. When my eyes met his, he gave one slow nod. He had seen it too. Whatever Judge Whitlock had recognized, it had shaken him. The door at the back of the room remained closed. No one moved. Natalie, believing her narrative had landed exactly as she intended, folded her hands and waited with a look of quiet triumph. She did not know that her entire foundation had cracked open the moment Judge Whitlock recognized my name. She did not know that the man she assumed would condemn me was the same man who had once watched me peel apart a fabricated case with precision. She did not know that he had just seen something inside her carefully, prepared evidence that did not belong. The tension in the room grew heavier with each passing second. Even the panelists shifted in their seats, sensing something was wrong but unsure what. I kept my gaze steady on the empty doorway, because I knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment the tide turned. Natalie thought the judge had walked out because of me. But I knew better. He had walked out because of what he had seen in her file. The room held its breath, suspended in the thick quiet that comes just before a truth finally forces itself into the open. I did not know what would happen next, but I knew this: the collapse had already begun. The silence in the hearing room felt stretched thin, like a wire pulled tight enough to snap. Every breath seemed louder than it should have been. Every shift of fabric echoed. Every second without Judge Whitlock felt heavier, heavier, heavier. Then the back door opened. The sound was soft, barely more than a click, but it rolled through the room like a drumbeat. Every head turned. Even Natalie straightened, smoothing her skirt, lifting her chin as if preparing for her victory to be confirmed. Judge Whitlock stepped inside holding a different file, not the one Natalie had submitted, a thicker one, a darker folder, stamped with the seal of the Massachusetts Bar Admissions Office. He did not look at anyone as he returned to his seat. He placed the new file in front of him with both hands. He took a slow breath as if steadying himself. When he finally lifted his eyes, he did not look at me. He looked at Natalie. The air shifted. Small, barely noticeable, but real. Natalie smiled politely, waiting for what she believed would be the start of the end for me. Mom gripped her tissue a little tighter. Dad leaned forward slightly. Ruth sat motionless. Caleb watched the judge carefully, his eyes narrowing with recognition. Judge Whitlock began by adjusting his glasses. He opened the bar admissions file, removed a single sheet of microfiche printout, and laid it flat on the desk. His voice was calm when he spoke, too calm. This, he said, is the original licensing record for attorney Olivia Hartwell, verified directly by the Massachusetts Bar Admissions Office. It includes her application, her bar exam results, her oath date, and her renewal history. Natalie blinked. The panel members shifted forward slightly. Mom covered her mouth. Judge Whitlock continued, "All records are complete. All renewals are timely. All certifications are valid. There are no inconsistencies." Mom made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. But Natalie did not crumble, not yet. She straightened her back more firmly and spoke with the same practiced gentleness she had used from the beginning. "Your Honor, I understand that, but the documents I provided clearly show irregularities. Perhaps there has been a system error or an administrative oversight. I would be grateful if the board could consider the evidence I presented." Judge Whitlock lifted her file slowly. He opened it to the first page. The room went silent again. He tapped the corner with one finger. "This document was created 7 days ago," he said, "not on the date indicated in the header. That is confirmed by the electronic timestamp embedded in the file." Natalie opened her mouth, but he raised a hand slightly and she went quiet. "This email," he continued, "was not sent by the Massachusetts Bar. The domain does not match. The routing signature is inconsistent with government servers." Ruth glanced at me but said nothing. She did not need to. He turned another page. "This license lookup printout includes formatting that did not exist at the WIXA time it is purported to represent. The Commonwealth did not adopt this numbering sequence until 2022. Mom's tissue slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. Dad leaned back slowly, shock settling across his face like a cold shadow. Natalie swallowed but held her expression steady. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still measured, "I believe you may be misinterpreting some of the technical aspects. I would be happy to clarify." The judge nodded slightly. "Yes, please do." He folded his hands and waited. It was in that pause, that fraction of a second, that I knew she would make the mistake Ruth had predicted. Natalie could not resist explaining. She believed she understood systems better than everyone else. She believed she could talk her way through anything. She believed her knowledge made her invulnerable. So she began. She explained the process by which documents could be exported from AES, compliance database. She explained the formatting rules. She explained metadata fields. She explained audit trails. She explained internal system timestamps. She spoke with fluency in a language she believed no one else understood, except Caleb. Halfway through her explanation, Caleb raised his hand slightly from the back row. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Judge Whitlock nodded. Caleb stepped forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. He approached the panel table and set down his laptop. "With your permission," he said, "I have prepared a forensic analysis of the documents submitted in this complaint." Natalie's face finally shifted. A small crack, a flicker of uncertainty. "Go ahead," the judge said. Caleb brought up the metadata logs and pointed to one line. "This document," he said, "was created on a machine registered to North Bay Freight Solutions. The system identifier is visible here." He enlarged the text. "And here." Natalie inhaled sharply. Caleb continued. "Additionally, the timestamp your witness referenced earlier has been overwritten. The original timestamp can be recovered using this forensic tool that tracks embedded version histories." He ran the tool. The real timestamp appeared on the screen. The panel leaned forward. This proves the document was altered. Natalie lifted her chin. Our systems are complex. It could be a technical glitch. Caleb shook his head calmly. Not possible. This pattern of alteration requires manual input. Someone intentionally modified the timestamp fields. He clicked again. And someone removed portions of the document that did not support the narrative presented in the complaint. The judge turned back to Natalie. Do you dispute this? Her voice turned colder. I believe there may have been misunderstandings in the technical processing. I uploaded them to ensure full transparency. If mistakes occurred, they were unintentional. Judge Whitlock closed her file with deliberate finality. He spoke slowly. Ms. Hartwell, it is highly concerning that you possess detailed knowledge of how to fabricate timestamp records and manipulate electronic documents submitted as evidence in a bar proceeding. Natalie went pale. Mom whimpered softly. Dad rubbed his face with both hands stunned. The judge continued. Furthermore, the complaint presents patterns of manipulation that indicate a deliberate attempt to mislead this board. This raises the possibility of misconduct far more serious than the allegations brought against Attorney Hartwell. Natalie's composure shattered just slightly like a stone hitting thin ice. Your Honor, she said, her voice brittle, I did not manipulate anything. I submitted what I had to protect the integrity of my company and my profession. The judge raised an eyebrow. Your company? Yes. North Bay Freight Solutions. That is where these files appear to have originated, and where the internal system traces led. Her breath caught. He leaned back. In light of this, I am ordering this hearing shifted to an evidentiary review of potential falsification of documents and the filing of a bad faith complaint. Mom gasped. Dad lowered his head. The room felt like it shrank. The judge then turned to me. Attorney Hartwell. I stood slowly. Your licensing status is fully verified and in good standing. All allegations against you are hereby dismissed. I exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Ruth placed a steady hand on my back. Caleb gave a quiet nod. Natalie stared at me with an expression I could not read. Shock, anger, fear, maybe all three. Judge Whitlock continued. This board will conduct a separate inquiry into the source of the falsified evidence and the motivations behind this complaint. Ms. Hartwell, you will remain present for questioning. Natalie's mouth opened. No sound came out. The panelists looked at her with the same eyes they had looked at me with, only minutes earlier. But now the direction of scrutiny has shifted entirely. Mom finally spoke, her voice trembling. Natalie, what did you do? Dad closed his eyes as if trying to steady himself. Natalie did not answer. She stared at the desk in front of her, blinking rapidly as though trying to rewrite the moment in her mind. But the room had already changed, and she knew it. Because this was the turning of the tables, the exact moment the narrative collapsed, the moment the lie could no longer stand. It was the moment I realized something else, too. Winning did not feel like triumph. It felt like gravity returning after too long suspended in air. The accusations against me were dismissed, but the weight of what happened did not lift the way I imagined it would. Relief came in small, quiet pieces instead of any sweeping wave. I walked out of that hearing room with Ruth beside me and Caleb following a sag. Few steps behind, and I felt strangely hollow, as if the ground beneath me had shifted and had not yet settled again. The truth was on my side. The record was clean. Natalie's complaint had collapsed in front of the panel. But the damage around the edges, the kind no hearing could undo, had already begun to spread. 2 days after the hearing, I received an email from Caleb. He attached a link to a regulatory notice that had gone out publicly. North Bay Freight Solutions had initiated a formal internal audit on misconduct within its compliance division. The notice did not mention Natalie by name, but the description left no doubt. She had been placed on administrative leave until the audit concluded. There was no drama in the notice, no accusation, no explanation. Just a few short sentences that shifted the weight of consequence directly onto her shoulders. Karma rarely spoke loudly. When I closed the email, I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. I expected to feel satisfaction, a sense of vindication, something sharp and victorious. But what I felt instead was a deep quiet, a kind of ache that lived under the ribs, because losing my license would have ended my career, my path, everything I had built. But losing the foundation she relied upon would unravel everything Natalie believed kept her safe. That knowledge did not make me feel triumphant. It made me feel tired. By late afternoon, I heard from my mom. She called 3 times before I finally picked up. Her voice was thin and stressed. She asked if she and Dad could come over that evening. I paused long enough that she whispered my name, afraid I would say no. I told her she could come. They arrived while the sun was still hanging low in the sky. Mom stepped inside first, clutching a small purse as if it were a shield. Dad followed slowly behind her. He looked older than he had a week earlier, like something had worn him down that he did not know how to name. They stood in my living room as if they had never been in my home before. Mom tried to smile. It trembled and faded. "We heard about Natalie," she said softly. "They told her at work to stay home until they finished some investigation." I nodded but did not offer anything more. Mom looked around the room before her eyes came back to mine. Olivia. We did not know what she was doing. We believed she was doing the right thing. She has always been so careful, so responsible. We thought she was trying to protect you or the family, or something important. Her words felt like stepping back into my childhood, into old rooms lined with expectations and unspoken rules. Dad stepped forward, clearing his throat. "This situation is serious," he said. "For all of us. For the family name. For your sister's future. If this becomes public, it will reflect badly on everyone." There was the phrase again. The family name. Something they had polished and protected for as long as I could remember. Dad continued, his voice steady but strained. "We think it is best if none of us talk about what happened. If we keep it quiet, the company might handle this internally. No legal trouble, no headlines. Natalie might still be able to salvage her career." I listened without interrupting. My mom looked at me with pleading eyes, as if hoping I would feel the same fear she did, as if hoping I would jump into the role they were offering. The peacemaker. The one who absorbs the blow so no one else bleeds. I asked quietly, "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Dad hesitated, then looked at the floor. "Just let this pass. Do not involve yourself any further. Let the company take care of their own. We cannot afford scandal. Not now, not ever." Mom stepped closer. "We need to protect our family. We need to stay together during this." Something inside me shifted sharply. Not anger, clarity. I asked them, "Have either of you asked how I'm doing?" They both froze. I continued, keeping my voice calm, not raising it, not wavering. I could have lost everything. My name, my livelihood, my standing as an attorney. She put my entire life at risk. She built a case designed to bury me. And you are asking me to help her recover from the consequences of her choices. Mom's eyes filled with tears. She reached out a hand but stopped midway. "We were scared," she whispered. "We thought maybe you had been careless. You take risks. You always have. She has never done anything reckless. It was easier to trust her. Easier, not right, not fair, just easier." Dad looked up then, and for a moment, something like regret flickered across his face. He said, "We thought you would be strong enough to handle it." I felt those words land with full weight. Strong enough, meaning strong enough to be doubted. Strong enough to be betrayed. Strong enough to be sacrificed for someone else's stability. I took a slow breath. I told them I was not going to retaliate. I was not going to speak to the media. I was not going after anyone. I was simply letting the truth stand. Dad shook his head. "That is not enough. The fact that this is out there at all will damage her. If you do not help shape the story, people will assume the worst. For her. For us." I asked him, "And what about assuming the worst for me? You signed a statement supporting her, not me." The words hung in the air like smoke. Dad opened his mouth, but no words came. Mom lowered her face into her hands. I felt no satisfaction in watching their guilt unfold. Only the same quiet ache that had been sitting in my chest since the hearing. Mom finally whispered, "We just want our family back." I said softly, "The family you want back is the one where everyone stays silent around this person who hurts them." Neither of them argued. Neither of them denied it. After another long silence, they left. Mom hugged me quickly, her tears warm against my cheek. Dad paused at the doorway as if searching for something to say, but nothing came. He nodded once and stepped outside. When the door closed behind them, the house felt impossibly quiet. I walked into the kitchen and stood by the counter, letting the silence settle around me like dust. Justice had been served. The truth had come out. Natalie was facing consequences she had earned herself, and yet none of it felt clean. Karma did not roar. It whispered. It moved through the cracks that people tried to ignore. It worked quietly, not with spectacle, but with inevitability. It did not need drama. It did not need applause. It simply waited for the moment when the truth became too heavy for the lie to carry any longer. In the days that followed, I kept practicing law as usual, moving through cases, filing motions, returning calls. But every now and then my mind drifted to my parents' house, to the way Mom had wrung her hands, the way Dad could not meet my eyes, to the way Natalie must have looked when the audit notice arrived at her inbox. I did not feel hatred toward her. Not anymore. Hatred required a burning I no longer had. What I felt was distance, a quiet truth settling into place, a realization that sometimes the deepest fractures in a family happen not through explosions, but through slow, small decisions that finally reveal their cost. Late one evening, I stood on my porch with a cup of tea and watched the neighborhood fade into dusk. A soft breeze moved through the trees. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere down the street, a window closed. Life went on, even after betrayal. Even after truth cut its way through the silence. And in that moment, I understood something I had never fully understood before. Karma does not strike to humiliate. It simply restores balance. And sometimes restoring balance feels like loss. Not because justice is cruel, but because the truth often confirms what you secretly feared all along. Some things were broken long before they fell apart. And as I stood there under the fading light, I finally accepted that the fallout between Natalie, my parents, and me was not the collapse of something whole. It was the quiet revealing of something that had never been whole at all. I walked back into the house after the sun had fully disappeared, and the silence inside felt like a line being drawn. A line that would not be erased or softened or blurred with time. I stood for a moment in the dim light of my living room, letting the weight of everything settle, letting the truth finally rest where it belonged. Some things were broken long before they fell apart. I learned that the hard way. But learning it did not feel like defeat. It felt like stepping out from behind a wall I had been pressed against my entire life. I could finally breathe without bracing myself for the next demand, the next correction, the next quiet reminder to be smaller. The fallout that followed moved quietly. No big calls. No confrontations. No scenes. The world has a way of rearranging itself without any noise when the truth comes to the surface. The morning after Dad and Mom left my house, I woke earlier than usual. There was a stillness in the air that felt almost new. I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and stared at the mug between my hands. For a moment, I wondered how life would look now that the storm had passed. I wondered what shape my family would take, what parts of it would remain, and what parts would dissolve. Then my phone buzzed. A single text from Dad. "We need to talk again." I put the phone down and let the message sit there for a long time. I remembered the way he had looked at me the last time we spoke, like he was trying to weigh two things in his hands and did not know which one mattered more, his daughter or his definition of family, his sense of order or the truth he never wanted to see. I typed back slowly. "I am not available," he replied within a minute. "This is urgent." I set the phone aside again and felt the answer rise from a quiet place inside me. "I am not available. Not now. Not anymore." I sent it. Then I turned the phone face down on the table. I expected guilt to rush in. It did not. What came instead was something calmer. The realization that saying no to someone who had always expected yes was not cruelty. It was clear. Later that afternoon, I drove back to the bar overseer's building to sign a final set of documents, confirming the dismissal of the complaint. The lobby felt different from the day of the hearing. My hands did not shake. My breath did not catch. I walked through the metal detector and down the hallway with the ease of someone no longer carrying someone else's story on her shoulders. Inside the small administrative office, a clerk handed me a slim envelope. Inside was the official confirmation that my license remained in good standing. Everything intact. Everything is clean. Everything I had built over years is still mine. I thanked her and stepped outside. The sky was a sharp, clear blue. A breeze carried the faint smell of the ocean from somewhere far off. I stood on the sidewalk and let the sunlight touch my face. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I saw Ruth approaching from across the courtyard. She raised a hand in greeting, her expression warm but steady. I walked toward her, grateful in ways I could not fully express. She asked how I felt. I told her the truth, lighter and heavier at the same time. She nodded, understanding without explanation. Some victories come with their own kind of grief. She reminded me that healing takes its own shape, and sometimes choosing distance is the kindest thing we can do for ourselves. We talked for a few minutes, mostly about the logistics of what would happen next. The board would proceed with its own inquiry, but I would not be involved unless absolutely necessary. Caleb continued to assist with documenting evidence. North Bay's internal audit was still underway. Then Ruth looked at me with quiet emphasis. You need to think about your boundaries now. Not just legally, personally. What you allow back into your life matters. Her words stayed with me long after she drove away. I walked for a while around the block, letting the breeze unwind the tension I had carried for weeks. Every step felt like reclaiming something small and essential. Something I had forgotten was mine. When I finally returned to my car, I paused with my hand on the door handle. It struck me that I no longer felt afraid. Not Natalie, not losing my career, not of the silence that now existed between me and my parents. I felt steady, grounded, untethered from the weight of someone else's expectations. That evening I made dinner quietly, letting the rhythm of chopping vegetables and stirring a pot bring me back into my body. The house felt peaceful, not lonely, not empty, just peaceful. My phone rang again. This time it was Mom. I let it ring, then I let it stop. A text followed. We love you. Please talk to us. I stared at the screen, feeling a pull I had felt my entire life. The pull toward smoothing things over, toward easing someone else's discomfort, toward fixing what I did not break. But something inside me finally spoke louder. I typed back a simple message. I need space, please respect that. Then I put the phone down and walked away from it. The following days unfolded quietly. I went back to work. I met with new clients. I pushed forward on cases that had been waiting. People congratulated me when they heard the outcome of the hearing. Some offered sympathy for the situation with my family. I accepted the kindness, but I did not dig into the details. The story did not belong to anyone else, not anymore. One afternoon, I sat in my office reviewing a case file when a memory surfaced without warning. The final moments of the hearing. The way Judge Whitlock had looked at me after dismissing the accusations. Not with pity, not with relief, with respect. He remembered the attorney who stood in his courtroom in 2020. 1. He remembered the work I had done. He remembered the truth I had laid out carefully, relentlessly, until the lies could no longer stand. That memory steadied me. I realized then that the only approval I had spent years chasing was from a family that never knew how to see me. I had measured myself by a standard they created, one that never fit who I was or who I wanted to become. Walking away from that was not a loss, it was a release. A week after the hearing, I received another text from Dad. Short, stiff. We should talk about how to move forward as a family. I did not reply. I did not need to move forward with the version of family he meant. The one where the truth was inconvenient. The one where loyalty meant silence and sacrifice. The one where Natalie's stability mattered more than my safety. I wanted something different. Something honest. Something rooted in respect, not fear. If they could not offer that, then I would move forward without them. One evening, I drove to the coastline north of Boston, parked my car near a quiet stretch of beach, and walked until the sand softened beneath my feet. The sky had turned shades of amber and lavender. Waves rolled in with a slow, rhythmic hush. I found a large flat rock and sat down, pulling my jacket closer around me. The air smelled of salt and seaweed. The wind brushed my hair back gently. I watched the water rise and fall for a long time. In the stillness, a thought settled inside me with the clarity of a truth I had known deep down, but never spoken aloud. The strongest revenge is not making someone hurt the way they hurt you. The strongest revenge is becoming someone who no longer needs the people who once had the power to break you. The tide moved in, then back out. The sky shifted from dusk to early night. The first faint stars appeared. I breathed slowly and felt something loosen inside me. My career has survived. My sense of self had survived. My integrity had survived. The only thing that had not survived was the illusion that my family had ever truly understood me. And losing that illusion did not feel like defeat. It felt like freedom. I sat there until the wind grew colder, letting the night settle around me. When I finally stood, I felt taller somehow, lighter, more certain of where I was going next. As I walked back toward my car, I thought about all the women who would understand this story. Women who had been told to shrink themselves to keep the peace. Women who had been called too much or not enough. Women who had carried the weight of family expectations until they could no longer breathe. I hoped they would hear this and feel seen. I opened my car door, sat down, and rested my hands on the steering wheel. The engine hummed softly when I started it. The headlights cut a path through the dark road ahead. I drove home with a sense of quiet certainty that the story I had lived was not just about betrayal. It was about the way truth can cut through silence, about the way dignity can survive even when loyalty fails, about the way walking away can be an act of courage, not abandonment. When I reached my driveway, I turned off the engine and sat in the stillness for one last moment. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from. Then I stepped out of the car and walked inside, leaving the past exactly where it belonged.